70 trucks heavy and silent, racing through the dark highways of Burkina Faso. Inside them, stolen gold worth millions vanishing into the night. But then one man stood in their path. Not an army, not a minister, the president himself. Africa's story has always been one of contrasts. A land blessed with treasures buried deep in the soil gold. Diamonds, oil, and fertile land. Yet its people, too often, live with empty hands, watching their wealth carried away by others. For centuries, ships came and left. Colonial masters dug, harvested, and shipped everything of value back to Europe. When independence came, people dreamed of freedom and dignity. But the truth was, harsh new chains replaced the old ones. Instead of foreign soldiers, foreign corporations arrived. Instead of open conquest, secret contracts were signed in polished offices. They promised development. They promised roads, hospitals, jobs. And yes, sometimes a road was built, sometimes a school was opened. But behind the curtain, the real wealth slipped away. Year after year, trainloads of minerals left Africa, while villages remained in darkness. In Burkina Faso, the story was no different. The people toiled under the burning sun, working lands their ancestors once called sacred. Mothers fetched water from wells that dried too quickly. Children studied under broken roofs with no books, no light, no future. And still every day tons of gold left their soil, never to return. But corruption is not only born from the outside. No, betrayal often comes from within. Some leaders, chosen to guard the people, became gatekeepers of theft. They dined with foreign investors, shook hands in air-conditioned rooms, and signed away the nation's soul for a personal fortune. They wore fine suits, gave long speeches, but behind those speeches lay silence. Silence bought with gold. And then came that night. The air was thick, the roads quiet, only the distant hum of engines breaking the silence. 70 massive trucks rolled like a mechanical army, headlights cutting through the darkness. Each one carried a secret cargo, containers sealed so tightly even the night air could not breathe inside them. But those who knew, those who whispered, understood the truth inside those containers was the lifeblood of Burkina Faso. Gold. Not a little, not a few bars, but mountains of it. The kind of wealth that could transform a nation overnight. Enough to build hundreds of schools where children could learn with dignity. Enough to fund hospitals, where mothers would no longer pray, helplessly, as they watched loved ones die from preventable diseases. Enough to build roads, bridges, clean water systems, enough to lift millions out of poverty. And yet, instead of being guarded as a national treasure, this gold was being smuggled out under the cover of night. A theft so grand it could not be committed by ordinary criminals. No, this was an operation of power, organized by elites, protected by silence. Think of the cruelty. Gold from African soil, dug with African hands, guarded by African soldiers, yet destined to enrich foreign banks. By morning, those trucks would be across the border. The gold would vanish into vaults far away. It would be melted, reshaped, sold in foreign markets, and bought back by Africans at prices they could never afford. It was not just theft, it was humiliation. It was betrayal. It was the slow bleeding of a nation's soul. And perhaps the most painful truth, the people were never meant to know. The convoy moved in silence, believing the night would protect them, believing that power and corruption had no witness, believing that Africa's story would once again repeat itself. Wealth stolen, people silenced. But history is strange. Sometimes it bends, sometimes the silence of the night breaks, and sometimes the people find a leader who dares to say, enough. And on that night in Burkina Faso, as those engines roared toward the border, a question heavier than gold hung in the air. Would this be another night of loss, or the beginning of something the world never expected? But fate is unpredictable, and on that night, fate wore the face of a soldier. Ibrahim Traoré was not born into palaces or wealth. He grew up like the very people whose future was being stolen, walking the dusty roads of Burkina Faso, listening to the struggles of farmers, seeing mothers beg for medicine, watching children carry dreams heavier than their empty school bags. He had seen the pain of poverty, but he also carried in his heart the fire of dignity. By the time the trucks rolled out, Traoré was already a man who distrusted the polished lies of foreign contracts. He had risen through the army ranks, respected not because of politics, but because of discipline, courage, and a rare quality his people longed for. He listened. He listened when villagers complained of hunger. He listened when miners whispered of corruption. And he listened when rumors began to spread about a convoy moving in the night, carrying away the soul of the nation. Most leaders would have ignored those whispers. Most would have let the gold vanish in silence, too afraid to challenge the unseen hands that controlled it. But Traore was not most leaders. He was a soldier first, and soldiers know that silence in the face of betrayal is the same as treason. Reports reached him in fragments. A truck sighted here, another there. Whispers from frightened villagers who dared not speak too loudly. Men in uniforms guarding something with unusual secrecy. Piece by piece, the picture came together until it could no longer be denied. This was no ordinary operation. It was a theft so vast it could cripple the country for decades. And in that moment he faced a choice. He could look away, pretend he never heard, and live like those before him, safe, comfortable, but guilty. Or he could act, knowing that to stand against this convoy was to stand against not just criminals, but an entire network of corruption, both inside and outside Burkina Faso. Acting meant danger. Acting meant risk. Acting could mean his downfall. But to do nothing? That was unthinkable, so he made his decision. Under the cover of darkness, he summoned loyal men. Not many, just enough to act swiftly, decisively. Men who still believed in honor, who still believed the uniform meant service to the people, not service to greed. They gathered in whispers. Away from prying eyes, maps spread on tables, roads traced with fingers, every detail calculated. The mission was clear: intercept the convoy. 70 trucks, heavily guarded, carrying billions in stolen gold. Outnumbered? Yes. Outgunned? Possibly. Dangerous? Without question. But history does not favor the timid, it favors the bold. And Traore, against all odds, chose boldness. As the engines of the convoy thundered closer to the border, a different sound stirred in the night. The sound of determination, of boots hitting the ground, of weapons being readied, of a leader rising not for power but for justice. The people of Burkina Faso did not know it yet. They slept under the same dark sky, unaware of the drama unfolding on their behalf. But destiny was moving. A new story was being written in silence. 70 trucks thought they would vanish into the night unseen. But ahead of them, waiting in the shadows, stood a man who had decided no more. The convoy was about to meet resistance, and Africa was about to witness the courage of Ibrahim Traoré. The night was thick, heavy with silence. But hidden within that silence, history prepared to turn. On one side, 70 massive trucks, steel giants crawling across the land like a serpent of greed. Their engines roared, their headlights cut through the dark, their cargo guarded by armed men who thought themselves untouchable. To them, it was just another operation, another night of theft. They had done this before. They expected no resistance. After all, who would dare to challenge such power? On the other side, a small band of soldiers gathered in the shadows. Led by a man whose heart beat with the fury of his nation, Ibrahim Traoré stood before them, not with grand speeches or empty promises, but with a simple truth. If we let this convoy pass, we lose more than gold. We lose our dignity. We lose our future. The men nodded. They knew the risk. They were few. The convoy was many. But numbers mean little when conviction runs deeper than fear. And so the ambush was set. The chosen spot was narrow, a choke point along the dusty road, where the convoy could not spread wide, where its size would become its weakness. The soldiers moved like shadows, blending with the trees, the rocks, the earth itself. Guns were loaded, radios checked, signals agreed upon. Every man knew there would be no second chance. The rumble grew louder. First, a faint vibration beneath their boots, then a distant growl. Finally, the thunder of engines filled the air as the headlights appeared, piercing the darkness like fireflies of greed. The convoy was approaching. 1 truck, 2, 5, 10, they kept coming. The ground trembled beneath the weight. Dust clouds rose, choking the night sky. Soldiers clenched their weapons tighter, hearts pounding. Some whispered prayers. Others clenched their jaws in silence. Traoré raised his hand. The signal. The first trucks entered the choke point. Then the middle. Then the last, 70 in total, stretching like a metal spine across the road, exactly as planned. And then, the trap was sprung. Floodlights flashed on from the hillsides, blinding the drivers. Barricades rolled out across the road. Gunfire cracked in the air, not aimed to kill, but to freeze. Orders were shouted, "Stop your engines! Step out of the vehicles!" Chaos erupted. Drivers slammed brakes, trucks screeched. The convoy shuddered to a halt. Guards scrambled, weapons in hand, but before they could aim, they were surrounded. Soldiers moved with precision, cutting through the panic with discipline. The night that was meant to cover theft now exposed it for the world to see. The commander of the convoy stepped forward, his face twisted with disbelief. He had expected obedience. He had expected silence. He had not expected Ibrahim Traoré. Their eyes met. One man represented corruption, betrayal, greed. The other represented defiance, honor, and the will of a nation. "Do you know what you're doing?" the commander hissed. "This gold is protected. You cannot stop us." Traoré's reply was calm, but it carried the weight of centuries. "This gold does not belong to you. It belongs to Burkina Faso." The standoff stretched. Fingers hovered over triggers. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. But slowly, one by one, the guards lowered their weapons. Not because they wanted to, but because they saw something they had never seen before. A leader unafraid to put his life on the line for his people. A leader who would not be bought, not be silenced, not be bent. And just like that, 70 trucks, billions, and stolen wealth stood captured. For a moment, silence returned. No engines, no gunfire, no shouting. Just silence. But this was not the silence of theft. This was the silence of justice. The silence of a nation reclaiming what was theirs. Imagine the scene. Containers creaking open under the night sky, revealing mountains of gold that glimmered even in the dim light. Soldiers stood guard, proud, their uniforms no longer symbols of oppression but of protection. And at the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré. Not as a president, not yet even as a ruler, but as a son of Burkina Faso who had dared to say enough. Word spread like wildfire. By dawn, villages knew. By afternoon, the nation knew. By evening, the world knew. Burkina Faso had stopped the theft. Burkina Faso had stood up, and in that moment something far greater than gold was reclaimed. Hope. The people looked at their young leader and saw not just a soldier but a guardian. Not just a man but a symbol that Africa could rise. That Africa could say no. That Africa's wealth could stay in Africa. That night 70 trucks were stopped. But in truth, it was more than a convoy that was captured. It was history itself. Caught red-handed, forced to face a new chapter. When the sun rose the next morning, it did not rise on an ordinary day. It rose on a new Burkina Faso. The gold, once hidden, once stolen in silence, now stood tall in the open air. 70 massive trucks, sealed and guarded, glimmered under the morning light like a golden army. Soldiers lined the roads, villagers crowded the edges. Children climbed on walls and trees just to catch a glimpse of what had been saved. And standing before it all was Ibrahim Traoré. Not just as a president in a military jacket, but as a man who had turned darkness into light. Word spread faster than the wind. In markets, women paused their trading and whispered to each other. They caught the thieves. In schools, children repeated the story as if it were a legend. The president himself stopped the trucks. In villages, drums echoed deep into the earth, announcing that justice had finally spoken, but the ripple did not stop there. Across Africa, radios buzzed. In Mali, Niger, Guinea, people heard the story and felt their hearts beat faster. In Dakar, in Bamako, and Kinshasa, men in taxis rolled down their windows and shouted across the streets, "Did you hear?" The trucks were stopped. The gold was saved. The news spread from village to village, from city to city, from one border to the next, until it crossed oceans and reached the ears of those who never wanted it told. In Europe, in America, in the glittering towers of corporations that had long fattened themselves on Africa's riches, silence fell. Meetings were called. Emails marked urgent flew across time zones. The plan had failed. Billions lost. And worse, an example had been set. For decades, Africa's wealth had been drained quietly, silently, with barely a whisper. But now the theft had been caught in the act. Now the people had seen the truth with their own eyes. The illusion was broken, and the world asked, if Burkina Faso can rise, who will rise next? Back home, Traoré stood before cameras with the captured trucks behind him. His speech was simple, but his words carved deep into the hearts of his people. "This gold belongs to you," he declared. "It belongs to our children, our schools, our hospitals, our roads. It will not be stolen. Not now, not ever again." The crowd erupted. Men lifted their fists. Women raised their voices. Children clapped and sang. For the first time in years, hope did not feel like a dream. It felt real. It felt possible. But the ripple grew even larger. In villages far from the capital, where people had long stopped believing in governments, fires were lit in celebration. Hunters beat their drums, farmers danced in the fields. Griots, the storytellers of Africa, began weaving this night into their songs. The story was no longer just news. It was legend. Mothers told their children, "Remember this day. Remember that we are not poor, we are rich. Our land is gold, our land is diamonds, our land is life. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." And in the cities, students painted murals on broken walls, pictures of trucks, of soldiers, of Traore standing tall. Graffiti became poetry. Poetry became chants. Chants became movements. But not everyone celebrated. In hidden corners of the capital, in luxury homes where wine glasses clinked and foreign deals were once signed in silence, fear crept in. Corrupt leaders, the ones who had fed on bribes and bowed to foreign masters, felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. Their secrets were no longer safe. Their power no longer untouchable. Because that night something bigger than trucks had been captured. Trust had been reclaimed. And once a people reclaim trust, they cannot be ruled by fear anymore. Soon after, investigations spread. Names were whispered, then shouted, then exposed. Men who once walked with pride through parliament halls now hid their faces. Some fled, others were arrested. Foreign businessmen, once untouchable, suddenly found their contracts torn, their access denied, and the people watched with wide eyes, realizing that for the first time, their leader was not selling them out, he was fighting for them. But perhaps the greatest ripple came not in the form of arrests, not in the form of gold locked behind gates, but in the form of belief. A belief that change was possible. In dusty villages where children once studied under trees with no books, parents now whispered, "Maybe tomorrow, they will build us a school." In hospitals where mothers cried because medicine was too expensive, doctors now said, "Maybe this gold will bring supplies." In crowded cities where young men dreamt only of leaving for Europe, they now wondered, "Maybe we can build something here, with our own hands, with our own wealth." Hope spread like a fire, and once hope burns, it cannot be easily extinguished. Traore knew the fight was not over. He knew enemies remained, foreign interests, greedy politicians, hidden traitors. But he also knew something else. The people were awake now, and a people who are awake cannot be enslaved again. Across Africa, young leaders, students, activists, soldiers, all whispered the same question. If Burkina Faso can defend its wealth, why not us? And somewhere in the boardrooms of the powerful, men in suits asked in fear, if this example spreads, how many more trucks will be stopped? How many more billions will we lose? Because this was no longer about 70 trucks. This was about an entire continent daring to rise. One night in Burkina Faso had shown the world that the tide could turn, that Africa's wealth did not have to flow outward, that Africa's sons and daughters could stand guard, could resist, could fight back. And so the night of the 70 trucks became more than a story. It became a symbol, a fire lit in the heart of Africa. For in the silence of that night, when engines roared and soldiers stood firm, when gold glittered under the moonlight and thieves trembled in fear, something far more valuable than gold was born: dignity, and dignity, once awakened, cannot be stolen. The night had been silent, but after the president's sudden move, silence no longer existed. The people of Burkina Faso woke up to rumors that their leader had stopped an entire fleet of trucks, loaded with stolen gold. At first, many thought it was just another tale of politics. But as dawn broke, images began to spread, grainy, half-hidden pictures of trucks lined up under the military's watch, soldiers surrounding them, engines still hot from the long escape attempt. Word traveled fast. Markets buzzed with whispers. Radios carried half-confirmed reports, and social media turned into a wildfire of speculation. Could it be true? Did Traore himself really stand in front of those trucks? For a nation that had been exploited for decades, where corruption had often swallowed wealth before it reached the people, this story felt different. It felt like the beginning of something larger. And outside Burkina Faso, the world was listening. News agencies scrambled to confirm details. Investors grew nervous. And foreign companies that once thought themselves untouchable suddenly felt a chill. If one man, the president of a small West African nation, could stop a heist of this scale, what else was he willing to stop? What other secret pipelines of wealth, running silently from African soil to foreign pockets, was he about to expose? But for the people on the ground, it was more than global headlines. It was personal. Mothers whispered hope to their children, saying this gold might finally stay with us. Farmers spoke of new possibilities. of schools, of hospitals, of roads that could finally be built with the resources of their own land. For once, the nation wasn't watching its wealth disappear into the night. For once, the trucks were not just a symbol of loss, they had become a symbol of resistance. And yet, even in celebration, fear lingered. Stopping 70 trucks was a bold move. But bold moves attract enemies. The question that burned in every mind was simple. What would come next? Would there be retaliation, pressure, perhaps even betrayal from within? Or had the balance of power truly shifted in favor of the people? This was no longer just about trucks or gold or even a single night. This was about the fight for a nation's future. As the news of the intercepted trucks spread beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, a storm began to brew. Powerful men in distant capitals sat in their offices, stunned by what they were hearing. These shipments weren't small. Deals they represented billions of dollars tied to international companies, secret partners, and even governments who had grown rich from Africa's hidden wealth. Suddenly, phone lines buzzed in foreign embassies. Urgent messages were sent. Intelligence reports warned of a leader who was no longer playing by the old rules. President Ibrahim Traoré had not just stopped trucks, he had shattered an illusion. For decades, the world had believed Africa would remain silent, its resources extracted without question. But now, one man had dared to put himself between thieves and the people's wealth. Inside Burkina Faso, the tension was electric. Supporters flooded the streets, chanting his name, waving flags, declaring him a hero of the people. Yet in the shadows, enemies stirred. Those who had benefited from this gold trade, corrupt officials, smugglers and foreign agents, were now desperate. For them, this wasn't just about losing gold. It was about losing control. Military convoys tightened their patrols. Government ministers whispered in closed meetings. Rumors swirled of bribes offered, threats made, and plots forming in the dark. Traoré knew the truth. Stopping 70 trucks was only the beginning of the war. The people felt a mix of pride and fear. Yes, they had a leader who was willing to fight for them. But they also knew the cost of defiance. History had taught them that those who resisted foreign powers often faced sabotage, coups, even assassinations. The air was thick with uncertainty. And then came the turning point. Foreign media networks, pressured by their own governments, began painting a very different picture. They called Traoré reckless. They called him dangerous. They claimed he was risking his country's future. It was the same old narrative, but this time the people were no longer fooled. They had seen the trucks with their own eyes. They had felt the truth in their own hearts. Still, a question lingered like a shadow over every celebration. How long could he stand against forces so vast, so powerful, so determined to reclaim what they had lost? One thing was certain: the night the trucks were stopped was no ordinary night. It was the spark that set fire to an empire of lies. And from that fire, a new struggle was born, a struggle that would test not just Traoré's strength, but the courage of an entire nation. The tension finally erupted. What began as whispers in backrooms and secret calls overseas had now turned into open pressure. Foreign governments that once smiled politely at Traoré suddenly released sharp statements. They accused him of blocking international trade and endangering partnerships. But everyone in Burkina Faso knew what they really meant. He had dared to stop the theft. Behind the scenes, powerful companies demanded their gold back. Lobbyists flooded international organizations, urging sanctions, warning of instability. It was an old playbook, one Africa had seen too many times before. And yet this time, the leader standing at the center of the storm refused to bow. Inside the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré gathered his closest allies. The room was heavy with silence, until he spoke. If we give in now, then all the sacrifices of our people will mean nothing. This is not just about gold. This is about dignity. His words cut through the fear like a blade. His generals nodded, his ministers clenched their fists. They knew what this decision meant. Defiance would not go unanswered. Then, as if on cue, the retaliation began. Reports came in of border tensions, of suspicious movements near military bases, of shadowy figures trying to bribe local commanders. Foreign media launched a storm of propaganda, branding Traoré a dictator, trying to fracture the unity he had built. Inside the country, small sparks of unrest were fanned into flames, protests engineered, divisions sown. It was clear the fight was no longer about 70 trucks. It was about breaking the will of an entire nation. But the people refused to break. Instead, they rallied. Across villages and cities, crowds marched in defiance. holding signs that read, "Our gold, our future." For the first time, ordinary citizens felt they were part of something historic. They saw themselves not as victims but as protectors of their land. The trucks, once a symbol of theft, had become a rallying cry of unity. The world watched in disbelief. How could one of the poorest nations in the world stare down power so vast? How could a young leader barely in his 30s hold his ground when others had fallen? The answer was simple. Traore wasn't just fighting for gold, he was fighting for a dream that Africa's wealth should finally serve Africa's children. And then came the moment no one expected. A leaked document exposed exactly who was behind the stolen shipments, names of companies' officials and foreign backers who had been bleeding Burkina Faso dry. The revelation shook not only the nation but the entire continent. Suddenly, the trucks were not just about Burkina Faso, they were about every African nation that had suffered the same silent robbery. The climax had arrived. Traore's stand was no longer a local story. It had become a continental roar, a direct challenge to centuries of exploitation. And now the world had to face a question it could no longer ignore. What happens when Africa finally says enough? When the dust settled, the image of those 70 trucks remained etched in the nation's memory. They were no longer just vehicles of stolen wealth, they had become monuments of defiance, proof that a people could rise and protect what was theirs. Inside Burkina Faso, the ripple effects were immediate. Schools and universities began to speak openly about the event, teaching young students that this was not just history in the making, it was their history. Farmers, miners, and traders who had once felt powerless now stood taller, knowing that the wealth of their land was not destined for foreign vaults, but for their own future. The streets echoed with chants of unity. For the first time in decades, hope outweighed despair. Mothers whispered to their children at night, saying, "Remember this day because this is the day we stopped being robbed." That single night transformed into a symbol of a nation reclaiming its dignity. But the impact did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. Across Africa, leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens watched closely. From Mali to Niger, from Congo to Ghana, the message spread like wildfire. If one small nation could stand up, why not us? The trucks had ignited a spirit far greater than themselves, a continental awakening. Foreign powers, too, felt the tremors. Boardrooms and ministries thousands of miles away were shaken. Questions were raised. Could this spark spread across Africa? Could other nations demand the same? For them, it was more than gold, it was the crumbling of an old order, an order built on silence and exploitation. And yet, while enemies plotted in the shadows, something even stronger grew in the light. A sense of unity, of courage, of determination that no propaganda could destroy. People realized that the battle for resources was not just about wealth. It was about freedom. It was about breaking chains that had bound them for generations. For Traore, the fight was far from over. He knew more storms would come, more attempts to silence him, more traps set in the dark. But the people's support had given him a shield, stronger than any weapon, their trust. And with that trust, he declared, "This victory is not mine. It belongs to every Burkinabe, to every African who dreams of freedom." In the end, the story of the 70 trucks became larger than life. It was retold in markets, in classrooms, in homes lit by candlelight. It became a story of resistance, of courage, of a turning point where a nation dared to say no. And perhaps the greatest ripple effect was this. The world could no longer ignore Africa's voice. The night those trucks were stopped marked the beginning of a new conversation, a conversation about justice, sovereignty, and the right of a people to own their destiny. Because sometimes history doesn't change with speeches or treaties. Sometimes it changes on a dark road, when one man stands in the way of 70 trucks and refuses to move. And so what began as a single act of defiance on a lonely road became a story that shook the world. 70 trucks of stolen gold stopped in their tracks, not by chance, not by luck, but by the will of a people who refused to be silent any longer. But this is only the beginning. Because if one nation can rise, imagine what could happen when an entire continent decides enough is enough. The question now is, will the fire that started in Burkina Faso spread across Africa? Or will powerful forces try to smother it in the dark? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain. History is unfolding before our eyes, and you don't want to miss what happens next. So if you believe this story matters, hit that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and most importantly, subscribe now, because here, We will continue to uncover the untold stories of Africa, of courage, of resistance, and of hope. Stay with us, the next chapter is coming.